Today we begin the book of Ezra. And Ezra and Nehemiah, a book that follows it, are basically believed that they are written by the same person that wrote Chronicles, 1st and 2nd Chronicles. And that at one time, all four of these books could have been combined, especially Ezra and Nehemiah, that, Nehemiah could have been kind of pulled out of a section of Ezra and then made separate. But Ezra begins with the same verses that 2nd Chronicles ended with in the first year of King Darius of Assyria. You know that the decree came from the king, according to what the prophet Jeremiah had spoken, that King Darius was instructed by the Lord God to let the Jews to return to Jerusalem, to Judah, to rebuild the city, to rebuild the temple. So the Babylonian captivity, the diaspora, the dispersal of the Jews was kind of coming to an end, and they were allowed to go back home again. And it didn't all happen at one time. King Cyrus was king, somewhere around 538, 535 BC. That King Cyrus made this decree that the Jews could return. And so, as we're going to be reading on, many of the families did, and we'll have some of the family names. They came to do the rebuilding, and of course they ran into some opposition, because the people that had settled the land that were living there now, weren't also excited about these Jews coming back and rebuilding their temple and the city. And so this first group that came back didn't get everything done. There was a second group that came under King Darius the first, around 520, 515 BC. And they again encountered much opposition, the continued opposition, maybe I should say. And they continued to work on it, but it wasn't completed. A third group, led by Zerubbabel, that was the second group, was Zerubbabel and Jeshua. But then the third group under Artaxerxes the first came, and this was more around maybe the 460 to 450 BC. So, 70 to 80 years after King Darius, or Cyrus rather, begins this. You're getting the names all confused and normal. But, and so this third group came then. And the fourth group, finally, led by Nehemiah under Artaxerxes II, somewhere around 400 BC. So 100 to 140 years, 150 years maybe, between when King Cyrus makes the first decree and King Artaxerxes II, this kind of the fourth group, fourth attempt, whatever we may call it, before things finally really come into place. And of course, there was opposition all the way through, but these Jews that were returning probably evidently still had this book of Moses that had been discovered and brought back, and so this group of Jews was very intent upon following the religious protocol that was laid out in this book of Moses. For worship and for community. They were greatly striving to become faithful to this God who had led their ancestors so many years previously out of slavery and captivity in Egypt. And they were looking for this same God to now lead and guide them as they were returning to the promised land. And that's, I think about returning to the promised land, returning home. The saying, home is where the heart is. Well, that's very true in so many ways, but still we have a yearning for that place that we grew up, and even though many of these Jews, they'd been gone for 70 years, many of these that were returning, maybe they had been children when they first left, but many of them hadn't lived there because they had been born in captivity. So the ideology of home was something different for them. And so as we begin to read again in chapter 1, it says, in the first year of King Cyrus, of Persia, in order that the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah the prophet might be fulfilled, King Cyrus made this decree that the Israelites could return to Jerusalem. They could return to Judah. They could again have their freedom. They could again be a people of God. And, he says, thus says the king of Persia, the Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth. So he's understanding that. And he has charged me to build him a house in Jerusalem, in Judah. So any of you who are among his people, may their God be with them, are now permitted to go back to Jerusalem. So they have the freedom, again, to move to where they had their roots, their family roots, their heritage in and through God's will and the blessing of the king. And so they begin to go. And as they're ready to go, the heads of the families of Judah and Benjamin, it says, and all whose spirits have been gone up, got ready to go and build. And their neighbors aided them with silver and gold vessels and all of these things. And more importantly, King Cyrus, it says in verse 7, King Cyrus himself brought out all the vessels of the house of the Lord that Nebuchadnezzar had taken when he had conquered Jerusalem and the temple had been destroyed. But all of these vessels of worship that King Nebuchadnezzar had taken as plunder were returned to the people of Israel so that they could again be put in the house of the Lord, in the temple, when it was rebuilt. And he released all of that into the charge of Mithridath, the treasurer, who counted them out to Shezabar, the prince of Judah. And then it tells us the inventory of, gold basins, 30, silver basins, 1,000, and on with all of what was returned to the people for the temple. And the chapter 1 ends with all of these things Sheshbazzar brought with him as the exiles were brought up from Babylonia to Jerusalem. So the return of the exiles, the return home. And, I've lived here where I live now since 1980, and this is home. And I grew up, just a few miles away, 17, 16 miles away. And McHenry is still home in many ways. And on Sunday mornings when I go to McHenry to preach, I'm preaching in the church that I grew up in. It's home. And it's important, that home. And part of what's important is the relationship with the people, with the relationship with God, and having grown up, in that temple, that church, and with the people around, that's just, it's a part of something more in so many different ways. And not that there are an awful lot of people there yet that were there when I grew up, but there are some. I have friends that I've known all my life, classmates that are there, and the same with going down to Mabel at Sutton. There's people that I've known, for 50, 60 years, and, a long time. And so being home and being a part of all of that is important, I think. Chapter 2 talks basically about the different peoples that come, names many of them. The numbers of the descendants of Perush were 2,000, and this and that, and on and on and on, and a lot of names and things. And the Levites coming and all of that. And then we get to verse 59. The following were those who came from Tel Melah and these other places. It says they could not prove their families or their descents, whether they belonged to Israel. And they were descendants of Deliah and Tobiah and Nekoda and all of these. And since they weren't able to firmly establish who they were, it says they looked for their entries in the genealogical records, but they weren't found there. So they were excluded from the priesthood as unclean. The governor told them they were not able to partake of most holy food until there would be a priest there to consult Uman and Thummim. And of course that Uman and Thummim again are, the the sacred lots that they would cast to determine things, you know, and it's one of those strange practices in so many ways. But, you know, since their names weren't found in the genealogy, and that's one of the important reasons for all of this genealogy, and what I kind of skimmed through. I didn't talk a lot about it here right now, but the genealogy of the Israelites, their ancestors, of those that came back to Jerusalem now. This genealogy was important, as we've tracked genealogy all the way through the Old Testament, and in the New Testament, you know, we have the genealogy of Jesus tracked for us, and the genealogy of many others, and so this who you are, belonging, and of course, again, that's a part of being home, being a part of the group, and all of that. So the verse 64, the whole assembly was 42,360, besides male and female servants, which were 7,337. I mean, specific numbers, 7,337, you know, not, you know, about 740, you know, but no, boom, here it is. And so it was very much that way. And it talks about how many horses they had and all of that too. They came to the house of the Lord in Jerusalem, and the priests, the Levites, and some of the people lived in Jerusalem and some in the surrounding areas. So the people are returning home as to what God has instructed, as to what God has prophesied through the prophets. And the people are excited to be coming back home again.